To get started. Thank you. I'm so pleased to see everybody here. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri communities here in the Canberra region and at the ANU, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, to recognise that these lands were never ceded. It's great to be here, and welcome to all of you to our National Water Week event, United for Australia's Water Future, Imagining Water Security in 2050. My name is Lorrae van Kerkhoff, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Water Futures here at the ANU. And it's my great pleasure to be the moderator of today's panel discussion. And we have some fabulous speakers who are going to be helping us to navigate this very complex, challenging, but really, really important question and task. We have 75 minutes in total, so I've got a few minutes just at the beginning to lay out what the issues are that we're going to be talking about today. I won't take up too much of your time, and then we'll hand over to our speakers. But of course, the theme is around water security. Each of our panelists has been asked to answer the question, what does water security for all look and feel like in 2050? And we were having a discussion a moment ago, just as we were meeting and greeting about, why 2050? Why do we want to think ahead in that time frame? And it's really important, I think, for us to be able to step out of the challenges of the here and now. There are plenty of challenges in front of us, today, this week, next year, in the coming couple of years, that really occupies so much of our thinking space and our activity and our time and our resources. To take a pause and to think about, well, where are we actually wanting to go in 2050? Can we think about what it is? Can we imagine what it is that we are striving towards here? And to have those conversations now to make sure that we're, really going in the direction that we want to be going, rather than just continually tackling the issues of the moment in front of us. So 2050 is far enough out that we don't have to be thinking about the here and now, but it's not so far that we think, we don't have to be worried about that, because we absolutely do need to be paying attention to it. Of course, I get the boring job of doing some of the definitions before we get started, and water security is another one. This is a concept that I guess we're probably all very, very familiar with, but it does have a formal definition. The one endorsed by the United Nations is, and I will read it, that water security is the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable water quality for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, socio-economic development, and for ensuring protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, and for preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. So even while there's a lot in that definition, it tends to be very functional. And of course, we know that those social, cultural dimensions of water are also crucially important, and something that I'm sure we'll hear about in the speakers today. And of course, for all, water security for all means that everybody has a right to access. And this is formalised again through things like the United Nations Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Thank you, Paul, for sharing this information with me. And also our Declaration on Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, make reference to water either implicitly or explicitly as something that's a fundamental human right. And I'm sure that's something that all of you feel. We feel this on a daily basis when we are sipping the clean water from our tap, or engaging with water in the many different ways that we do. Sustainable, of course, ensuring water security for the environment helps to restore and sustain it so future generations can have access and maintain a connection to the wild places, natural resources and outstanding heritage Australia is known for. That's from the federal government's Nature Positive plan. So incorporating this sense of sustainability, that it is a natural asset and is such an important part of our natural environment, is significant. So achieving water security over the long term is obviously an ongoing challenge, which our panelists are all very well placed to help us tackle. The format of this session is that each panelist is going to make some opening remarks in response to the key question that we have posed for them: what does water security for all look and feel like in 2050? They'll then have an opportunity to make one brief comment on something else one of the other panelists has raised, and we will go to the floor and online for questions at that point. In consultation with Michelle Hobbs, whom I'll introduce formally in a moment, and out of respect for any Indigenous members of the audience in the room or online, I recognise that many may be observing the week of silence that has been called for in response to the referendum result on the weekend. And accordingly, I ask that members of the audience do not ask questions directly about the referendum, the Voice, treaty and related matters in this session. With that, I have the great pleasure of introducing our first speaker. So Michelle Hobbs is an associate lecturer and PhD candidate with the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University. Michelle is a proud Indigenous scientist, a descendant of the Bidjara people of central Queensland. She is a freshwater ecologist working in rivers and wetlands. She has experience in fish ecology, state government water policy and wildlife conservation. Michelle's current research is on freshwater mussels and Indigenous knowledge of river ecology, and she's passionate about advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples to be involved in water management and interdisciplinary education that's inclusive of culture, arts and science. So certainly the perfect person to be kicking us off this afternoon. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Lorrae, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands that we're on today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also pay my respects to my own elders. I'm a descendant of Bidjara from central Queensland, and I also have blood connections to Dunghutti from Central Coast, New South Wales. So I'm a Murray and a Koori, so it's pretty complicated when it comes to state of origin. I'd also like to echo what Lorrae said about acknowledging the elders that are in mourning this week over the weekend's results. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as you probably all know, have been here for a pretty long time. 65,000 years is what we've got up to with evidence so far. So it's a really long time. So our ancestors have lived through past climate changes before, so previous ice ages, sea level changes, and part of the basis of their approach to that was always starting from a place of healthy country. Healthy country comes first, and when you look after country, country looks after you. And that also included pretty deliberate practices when it comes to land and water management. Many of you might not realise, but some people actually deliberately managed the flow conditions in wetlands to improve the water quality. So at the end of the wet season, bit of in-stream channel modification to extend the period of flow, and that increases the amount of time that you can use that drinking water into the dry season. Also in-stream vegetation management, that kind of thing. So a lot of really intentional practices. So having healthy catchments is really key to adapting to climate change. Having that healthy basis to go from is going to be really key moving forward. We have a really diverse nation when it comes to culture. So we have more than 500 languages, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and each of those people have their own connections to the places that they come from, their own lands and waters. And I really think that that's one of the strengths of what Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people have to offer, is that really long continuing connection with those individual places. And that the way that manifests is generation after generation of observations handed down over many thousands of years, and that comes with a really deep connection and understanding of how the land and water works in that place. So when I think forward to water security in 2050, I also think time is not necessarily linear in the way that we think of past and future, but time is also a cycle. So when we think forward to the legacy that we're leaving for our future generations, it's also helpful to think about, the way that we think of it, Indigenous culture, if I'll just explain it that way, is our great-great-grandchildren we think of as our great-great-grandparents. So there's an endless cycle. So when you are leaving things in a not great condition for the future generations, you're only doing that to yourself indefinitely. So in that way, that's really important to keep in mind for water security. Sorry, it's been a really big week. So sorry if I'm not particularly articulate today. But I did also want to say that climate change, we only have about 200 years of official meteorological records to draw on when it comes to water management and things like that. We were talking just before about groundwater recharge and how that mainly happens during big flood times. And really, we're basing some of those, the levels that we take out of the systems on only 200 years of data. So that's another way that some of our Indigenous long-term experiences of bigger droughts in the past could be really valuable just in our broader perspectives. But mostly what I wanted to say today about water security in the future is when it comes to engineering solutions and thinking about the way that we're going to physically manage water, we need to make sure that these outcomes are going to support all of community and are going to support the social aspects of how we use water. I hear lots of stories of during droughts and dry times in small communities like Menindee and Wilcannia. When the water dries up, the whole community suffers and mental health suffers, and you hear stories about kids getting up to no good because they've got nothing else to do. Whereas when the water comes, they go fishing, you know, whole families are down there, multiple generations. There's that wonderful intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And that's really important, particularly for our culture, but for the whole community. So when we're engineering solutions, how can we fulfill that need that society has for water as well? So perhaps recycled water can play a role in that, you know, rather than just keeping all the water in a Wyrwoll or in off-river water storages, making sure that we have physical access to those water places is really key. Yes, so having Indigenous people at the table is really key in making sure that all of these aspirations that the community has are understood. And also Indigenous-led research is going to underpin the way that we move forward in water management. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. No worries about being articulate in that. That was fabulous. And, you know, a lot of points that we can come back to. But I'm going to pass now to Emeritus Distinguished Professor Cynthia Mitchell. Cynthia was a key member of the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney for over 2 decades. She's worked alongside industry and government across Australia, Asia and the Pacific at the cutting edge of improving ecological, economic and social outcomes of urban infrastructure, and weaving her engineering and science expertise with insights from learning, systems, social science, futures, and new economics. In 2015, Cynthia was named as one of the Australian Financial Review / Westpac's 100 Women of Influence. So influence away, Cynthia. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorrae, for the lovely introduction, and thanks to AWA for the invitation to be here. Thanks also to my fellow panelists and to our audiences here and online. I'm looking forward to a rich discussion. And Michelle, thank you for starting us off so well. So first, I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal peoples, the traditional custodians of the land and waters in Earth and Sky Camp here where we meet today. Always was, always is, always will be Aboriginal land. I'll probably get teary because it was a big weekend, as we know. I just want to say I proudly stand alongside my Indigenous brothers and sisters and pledge to help continue the work for proper recognition of the world's oldest living culture, for truth-telling about our history, and for treaty to enable Indigenous wisdom. It's tough when you know, when the tears well up and you can't read your bloody notes. For Indigenous wisdom to prosper and to support us all in the challenging times ahead, yeah? So second, what does water security for all look and feel like in 2050? Well, 2 qualities stand out for me. I reckon it's relational and it's regenerative. If we're still here in 2050, and that's a real question now, even climate scientists are using terms like gobsmackingly bananas to describe what we've witnessed this year. So if we're still here, it will be because we were able to shift direction and to focus all our efforts towards regenerating this amazing planet. So activities that are net positive from the get-go in every direction. And we will have moved towards love. This is a science and engineering chat, isn't it? Am I in the wrong room? The kind of love that M. Scott Peck talks about when he says, love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. One more time. Love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. This is being relational. We need everyone's ingenuity and creativity and generosity if we're to be in a world still worth living in 2050. And here in Australia, we have an extraordinary resource. And that's the deeply relational wisdom of our Indigenous peoples and their understanding of how to work with rather than on our landscapes. Third, what does that mean in practice, this relational and regenerating world? What will water security for all look and feel like? Well, I think it might be soil security. Shifting how and where water moves through the atmosphere and the landscape may be the only thing that can cool the planet in the rapidly closing window we now face. And for that, soil health is critical. If our soils are replenished and full of carbon, water, diverse organisms and nutrients, then not only will we be much closer to water security for all, but also we'll have nutrient-dense food security. And in a climate-challenged world, food, water, and nutrient security will no longer be able to be taken for granted. So it's relational and it's regenerative. And we get there by putting love and soils at the top of our agenda. And that requires leading with grace and humility. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I wasn't expecting to hear love and soils in the framing of this, but that's fantastic, and perhaps a nice segue to our next speaker, Kate McBride. Kate is the Parliamentary Liaison Officer at the Australia Institute. She was born and brought up in far west New South Wales and maintains her connection to rural Australia through various committees and board roles. Over the past 5 years, Kate has become a familiar face in the fight for a healthy Darling Barker River and Menindee Lakes, and has been interviewed for a number of programs. Most notably, you may have seen Kate on Australian Story, Crimea River, and the ABC's Q&A. So furthering the Q&A theme, let's give Kate the floor for your views. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country on which we're meeting on, and also pay my respects to the elders from the country I come from as well, the Barkindji people. I truly believe it weren't for them that I wouldn't be standing or sitting here today talking about water. Naya Ima Baka Nungu. I am a Darling River woman. So this chat is a lot about looking at the future, but I also think we need to think about where we're at right now. I'm 25 years old and I've grown up along the Darling Barker River out near Menindee. I've witnessed mass fish kills, the most recent just this year with around 30 million fish dying, and standing beside Barkindji women as they cry out. People always ask how it is to experience those fish kills, but it's those little memories. I always say it's easy to write it, and then when you read it, bloody hell. Experiences like that, walking along kilometres of a bone-dry Darling Barker River, a river that I grew up that had water in it, and walking past thousands of the Darling Barker mussels, and our communities living off of donated water because we don't have fresh water to live with. That's the reality that we're at right now. And for me, it's kind of hard to talk about water security in 2050 when we don't have water security now. We have a long way to go in a lot of communities. And it's bleak. And with climate change, recognising that all of this is going to get worse, sometimes it just makes you feel like throwing your hands up in the air and going, what can we do? And I think a lot of people feel like that sometimes. I'm scared about what the future looks like for our rivers. The river that I grew up alongside is not the river that past generations have. And the future that the river that I'm on now is not the river that my children will know. And that's hard. And I hope that it's better. But we have a lot of work to do to get there. And it's quite fitting that we're sitting here today on National Water Week, while today our federal parliament is debating the Reviving Our Rivers Bill, which sort of extends basin plan deadlines till 2026 and 2027. But then what? And I think that's why hopefully some of you have come to this discussion today to maybe have a bit of a discussion about what that looks like. For me, water security looks like communities up and down the river being able to swim, work and play alongside waterways that have enough quality and quantity about them. It's rivers being meeting places where we come together instead of dust bowls that break our hearts to look at. And it's communities having good quality water that our foods can be grown with, and that our environment is sustained through the good and the bad. It's water, I suppose, overall being recognised as our most precious resource instead of a commodity. That all sounds pretty grand, but how do we get there? I think a lot of this comes down to putting science before politics, and unfortunately, our water policy has been more politics than science for too many years. Unfortunately, due to human nature, we're always going to have rules and regulations about water take. In an ideal world for me, we'd be able to use what's been described as a bit of an Aboriginal basin plan, where according to Ngarrindjeri elder Tom Trevorrow, it goes something like, don't be greedy, don't take more than you need, and respect everything around you. So I think incorporating those rules and regulations that unfortunately the Australia of today needs, also with some of those knowledge and the practices of our First Nations people, are going to be really important moving forward. Listening to our country and our First Nations people and empowering them with not only decision-making powers, but also ownership as well. Where people recognise a healthy river benefits everyone and a balance is found between the environment and consumptive use. And that will come down to some tough decisions that I'm not totally sure Australia is quite ready to have and make right now in terms of where our water goes. The basin plan made tough decisions about the environment, what's going to survive and what's going to die. And I think when it comes to where our water will go in the future, we'll need to think more collectively and less through the eyes of individualism.
Thanks, Kate, and really highlights that our connection to water, our reliance on water, is so much more than the commodity that we often are forced to consider. And pass on now to Dr. Paul Wyrwoll, who is a research fellow at the ANU Institute for Water Futures and the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy. Paul works on water economics and policy in Australia and the Asia Pacific. And his current research focuses on risk, cost, benefit analysis of water infrastructure projects and the economics of drinking water provision in regional and remote Australia. And I know that Paul will be empathetic to the views that we've heard so far, despite his economist tag. So I'm going to pass on in that sense.
Thanks. Thank you, Lorrae. I acknowledge continuing connections of the custodians of the creeks, the waterways, the land, country, where we are today, the Ngunnawal, Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to talk about drinking water and thinking about 2050 for me, and what frames the way in which I plan out my research and my policy engagement as I think about the human right to water. So in 2050, what that would look like, if we go to the covenant, international covenant, and the general comment 15 that was developed under that, would be that all Australians, without discrimination, by 2050, have access to sufficient water for their drinking, cooking, cleaning, other domestic purposes, that it's reliable, it's affordable, it's safe, and that's of an acceptable quality in terms of taste, smell, look, feel. Now, we know, as Kate and Michelle have already referred to, we know that there are many places around Australia where that simply isn't the case right now. And we know that there are community organisations, communities themselves, in the case of Wilcannia and Indy, that had to sort it out and get clean water trucked in from Adelaide. We know that there are people in industry and people in policy, like our colleagues sitting to my left here, who are really working hard to try and improve access to drinking water today. whether that's through infrastructure programs, whether that's in terms of improving the health of our rivers and our aquifers. But I think thinking about how we get there, because it's a big challenge, would be an important place to start is actually what customers and consumers, in terms of their drinking water in regional remote areas, do they know what's coming out of their tap? So there's a really important part of the human rights of water that people often forget about, and that is that people have got the right to information about their water services. And that seems like a fairly straightforward thing to expect. And in Australia, we would understand that to be something along the lines of understanding reporting against the drinking water quality guidelines for aesthetic and health-based parameters. What are the health-based targets in a particular service area? What are the risk management decisions that are being made by service providers on behalf of people? And why this is important is because it enables people and consumers to be engaged in an informed conversation about what their expectations are. What do they need? And then be able to hold government agencies and their service providers to account for what the outcomes are. Now, I led some work we published last year. We were trying to get a sense of all of the drinking water quality reporting across Australia in terms of trying to understand how many people don't have access to safe, good quality drinking water. One of the things that really stood out for me is that there are so many gaps, not just in terms of monitoring, where there are people accessing services or water sources and they don't know there isn't any monitoring going on, but also that there isn't public reporting where there is monitoring actually happening. So New South Wales, for example, it is not required by regulation for water service providers to report drinking water quality to their customers in 2023. That's crazy to me. And although there are about a quarter of water service providers that do that, there's about 1.2 million people in regional and remote parts of New South Wales. They can buy a can of soup at the supermarket, they know what the ingredients are, but they don't know what's coming out of their tap. So that is an example of some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of being able to provide that information to people so they can have those informed conversations. And it's something that also applies to other areas outside of the major service areas of the utilities. So although remote Indigenous communities in WA, service provision has been switched over to WA, the Water Corp in WA, Department of Communities, for a long time, there are places like Mulga Queen and others where people didn't know what was coming out of their drinking water. Now, this isn't just about data, of course, right? So people like me and my pointy-headed economist hat, as Lorrae mentioned, but it's also about how information is delivered, how information is understood to be able to have that engaged conversation. And it's also, there is some co-benefits here in terms of policymakers, because then if we have that data and that information and that knowledge on what water services are, whether we're meeting the human right to water, then there's an evidence base for policy. What's working? What's not? Where do the priorities need to be? So I think that could be a really useful start and a very tangible start looking towards 2050. Information, data, transparency, and an evidence base. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about how much do we really know and what do we need to know to be able to make these good decisions, make better decisions about our water is crucial. We're going to move now on to someone who really, it's not your job, Matt. So Matt's the general manager of the water sector program at the Bureau of Meteorology. His job is to increase the value and impact the Bureau provides to Australia's water sector, which includes water planners, water managers, water-dependent businesses and water-dependent communities. I think that includes all of us, really, doesn't it? Matt has a background in water policy and water science and qualifications from the ANU and the University of Oxford. So looking forward to hear your follow-on from the call for better evidence, information and transparency. Thanks, Matt.
It's always a bit difficult. I'm going at this point in a very qualified panel, but Paul, you did steal half my points and I don't have time to come up with new ones, so I might repeat a few of them. But before I start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people, also the Cammeraygal people where I live now, and particularly the Gomeroi people, who are the traditional owners of the land where I grew up in, and in recent months have been very generous in teaching me some of their perspectives on the land and water in which I grew up. So I feel like I probably have the most technocratic answer, although Paul, maybe we can compete on that. But I also think that my 2 points might be achievable before 2050. And I think to the points of Kate and Cynthia, we probably need to achieve them before 2050. So they're two things and they sound very benign, but bear with me. So point one is by 2050, we have plans in place that detail how water will be managed under all plausible climate conditions, and that these plans will be accessible to everyone. And the second point is that we have full visibility for everyone on where water is, its quality, what it's allocated to, and how it's being used, which does relate to my job. So with my answer, I just want to say the why and then some steps I think we need to get there. So around water plans, the first part of the why is pretty obvious, that governments and industry need to be prepared. And the second part, and this is where I think we're currently falling short, is that we need communities to be prepared too, and that communities have the ability to engage in those discussions. So the positive news for us is we're the most advanced country in the world in terms of having sophisticated water plans that adjust to a very big range of climate conditions. However, at the moment, they're very technical documents, and they don't allow for great community participation in those discussions. So even where water plans work effectively, droughts tend to sneak up on people, and they can't engage in the conversations for what that plan means for their community because it's not an accessible document. So that was the positive news, is that we've got probably the best foundation of any country in the world to have this conversation going forward. There's a few challenges, and I think really putting my Bureau of Meteorology hat on here, a lot of our approaches to managing water, and in fact planning in general, assume that the future climate will look like the past. And we now accept in Australia that's not true. But there's a lot of work to do to change our planning assumptions. Everything in Australia, from how you build a gutter, to how you build a dam, to how you build a highway, to how you manage water, in some way has been underpinned by that assumption. And there's a huge amount of very technical, very dry, but very important work to change those assumptions. The second bit, and this is probably where my passion comes in, is we probably need, this is going to sound funny, we probably need to stop obsessing about what will happen in the future and start preparing for what could happen in the future. There is inherent uncertainty in climate risk, and I feel like we spend a lot of time trying to narrow that uncertainty and insufficient time planning for what we know could happen. To me, climate change is not a climate science problem. And that might sound funny, but if climate change was a climate science problem, we would have solved it 40 years ago, because climate science hasn't actually changed very much in that regard. So I see the journey we're on in terms of solving climate change and water security is similar to trying to land people on the moon. And in that scenario, the climate scientists are like the astronomers. They can tell you that the moon's over there, it's that far away, and it might change in terms of its distance from the Earth, and it's this big. But you need an incredibly multidisciplined team to build a spaceship to get humans there. And I think that's really what I want to see change between now and 2050, is a genuinely multidisciplinary approach to how we solve these problems. So what will that require? It'll require tremendous breaking down of existing barriers across scientific disciplines, across institutions, across jurisdictions. Require a lot of leaving egos at the door when we have SMEs and communities and interests in a room, which requires shared vision. We probably need to stop obsessing over averages a little bit. We had a bit of this discussion beforehand, but we often talk about big facts, and we want to put in the newspaper like the Murray River is going to have 25% less water in the future, or 30% less water in the future. And I don't know why we plan for averages in this country when we never have them. So take the Darling River, for example. We've never had an average year in the Darling. The average year is the product of all the dry years and all the wet years. So actually having a look and asking the right questions, not is the Murray River going to have 30% less water or 35% less water in 2050? But what do we do if we have a 4-year drought in the basin? Because we know that could happen. We know that that's when things start falling over. So my last bit, and this is sort of acknowledging a bit of bias in my role in the Bureau as Australia's Water Information Agency, is a really different approach, and one that scares me but excites me at the same time about our approach to water information. So in 2007, when the National Plan for Water started, there was a real absence of information. The Bureau was brought into that space for 2 reasons. One, we're good with data, and 2, we were an independent agency that's not involved in water management. And we just started producing products, reports, portals, widgets. And now here we are in 2023, and we have a significant problem in society with misinformation. And the problem is no longer a lack of information, it's actually that people are overwhelmed. They don't know where to start. There's so many institutions involved in water. And if we're going to solve that problem and create an information ecosystem that allows everyone to participate in debates about what water security will look like and to adequately represent themselves, we're going to need to have a fundamental change about how organisations, public, private, state, federal, local, work together to have an agreed set of facts that we can have a constructive conversation on. And my view for success for an organisation like the Bureau is not naive enough to think that we'll ever stop fighting over water in Australia, but at least we're fighting with the same facts. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Matt. And you know, I take comments from all of the speakers here, and a lot of the things that have been raised are really about how we change the way we work together in the management of water, and that's a key task that sits in front of our last panel speaker, Matthew Dadswell. Now, Matt is the head of the Water Reform Division at the Commonwealth Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Matt's working on water and biodiversity policy, and most recently has supported the Australian government to implement national and Murray-Darling Basin Plan water reforms, and has led programs to improve the monitoring and compliance in water use. So certainly some of the themes we've just been hearing. Matt has represented Australia internationally at a number of multilateral and bilateral water forums. So it's going to be a great way to wrap up this panel, I think, to learn from Matt, what are some of the options that we might have for how we change the way we govern water. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorrae. Thanks, Lorrae. No pressure. So I'd also like to begin by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting here, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and also those who are online, and pay my respects to elders past and present. It was good that, Lorrae, you started with the definition of water security, and laced all through that definition is a very human element, and references to what's acceptable water quality, and the very heavy layering of values, and we've heard that from a number of the speakers here, that goes into that. So a couple of things I'm going to talk about, which particularly face regularly from a policy government perspective, is firstly around expectations. And again, we've heard some things around that. So community expectations around water, what does that mean? What is it going to mean for the future? And then secondly, the other thing that we've been talking a bit about, and where it sometimes ends up, is what's the nature of collaboration and decision-making that then supports some of those really tough decisions that we know we've had and will continue to have. So just on expectations, what do we as a society expect or think water security means? And that's changing, and that changes. So what are the levels of availability, cost of water, quality of water that we're willing to accept? What sort of health of our rivers are we willing to accept? We all feel connections deeply to water, but our expectations change over time, and that's something when we're particularly talking about looking into the future and things as they are now. We've seen in recent times, even in my lifetime, seen very much a changing attitude to what we're willing to accept in terms of minimum standards for drinking water, and we're seeing an increasingly less willingness to accept that some communities in Australia don't have access to regular high quality drinking water, and we're seeing recent commitments from government to try and address or go some way to addressing that issue. we're starting to see even the question of trucking water into communities is becoming something that may not be acceptable. That this is something that, even though it might stack up actually economically and or environmentally, is not something that we would say is particularly a secure water future for that community. So I think those sort of expectations, and we could look at the health of our rivers. Are we willing to see rivers run dry like we might have in the past, but not so much now? In times of drought, when water is of course scarcer, we all feel the pain of water availability, the impact it has on families and values and culture and our livelihoods and businesses and the environment. And in those times, I think we've seen community expectations move really quickly and almost catch governments a bit unawares and really certainly in the last drought in the Murray-Darling Basin in 2018-19, trust and transparency really became the big buzzwords as people really started, particularly as water gets scarcer for you, you start feeling, you a bit more care about who's using all the water. Am I getting my fair share and so forth. And we all look for that information, and we all look for that app. I think the BOM does have one, don't they? An app that's going to tell us that in fact the person next to me is getting the same amount of water as I am, and it's all fair. So trust and transparency are really important. And again, at the time, we saw huge investments in water information, almost to the extent now that of overload, as Matt pointed out, and establishment of inspector generals and things like that to sort of bring that level of accountability into the equation. So I think community expectations, particularly in a democracy, are important, and they don't stay static. They are going to change, and they will change into the future. We need to be aware of that. The second point I'll touch on is collaboration decision-making, or what, probably in a bureaucratic sense we call governance. I'm talking about how people and societies engage and make decisions. And with water being an essential resource, its use and allocation, of course, is highly contested, and we have to make tough decisions, as Kate mentioned. And so that decision has to be extremely robust. And when governance is lacking, water gets wasted, and it leads to conflict. So it's not something to be taken lightly. We have good foundations, I think, in Australia. We're fortunate we're an island state. We don't have to compete with another nation for our water. So that we should be eternally grateful for. We should be grateful for, as much as I sometimes hate it, our federation and the fact that we have to work between states and local government and communities and federal government. And I think we're well trained in and have been well established systems in there. We can do better, but we've had some practice at this. So we have that capacity. We've seen big investments in places like the Murray-Darling Basin, Great Artesian Basin, Lake Eyre Basin, where there are transboundary matters within Australia, where we have been able to make some hard decisions, have been able to get community input, and have generated good data. Again, we could do a lot better, but these are in comparison to many other parts of the world, we're leading. So going back to my first point, community expectations keep rising, which of course then pushes decision makers to be more accountable and decisions to be more robust and the data to be better. So what does water security look like in 2050? We'll certainly have, I think, higher expectations within the community about water availability, about its quality. How often do we hear phrases these days such as, in this day and age, we should not have communities that don't have access to water, the rivers should not be healthy and so forth. Well, those same things are going to be said in 20 years' time or 30 years' time. So we can understand that expectations will continue to change, and we need to keep up with that. We will have a society that is significantly better informed through better information. They'll want to access information, and they'll want to know really what is the status of their own water security. And we'll need, to be able to keep up with all that, we'll of course need improvements in the way that we collaborate, the way that we participate in decision-making, the way that we access data, so that we can make good water resource allocation decisions. Thank you.
Wow. All right. Thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists. And we are going to now return for another cycle through the panel for some brief comments and reflections, picking up maybe just one key thing that you've heard from another speaker on the panel to reflect on, maybe to challenge, to put your own spin on. We'll do that in just one moment, but I'm going to hold the chair for a minute and bring together what I see as some of the themes in the discussion so far. And the first one that I've heard a lot of points being made about is collaboration. There is such a strong need for continually improving the ways in which we collaborate on water decision making. So we can really ask ourselves, what does good collaboration for water governance and water management look like in 2050? And that's going to be, through the eyes of our next generation. That's not necessarily the people sitting here at this this panel, but what's the next generation going to be thinking about? How are they going to work together, and can we set them up to do that better and more productively? So making good decisions in 2050 might be more about bringing different knowledges together, navigating different interests and values in ways that are respectful and positive, and really understanding that the diversity of views, experiences, values is an asset. It's not a problem to be fixed. How we engage widely and lead with a collaborative mindset is not just about what we're making decisions about, but also how we are making those decisions. The second theme that I found really striking was that of connection. How are our next generations going to connect with water socially, culturally, environmentally, and economically in 2050? And this is not a technical question. This is a question that's as much about ethics and morals as it is about the sort of the technicalities. Thinking about where all of the community needs and objectives are met is not only about water supply. We can certainly think about or imagine a future where we may well have access to clean, safe water coming out of the tap. But if we've lost all of those cultural and social connections that our other speakers have raised, we will have lost so much. So how can we think about that connection and incorporate that sort of multidimensional valuing of water into it is important. And the third one is change. It's convenient that they all start with C. It's kind of meets my criteria. Change, how we cope with change. And it's climate change, absolutely. We are all very aware of that. But there are also other changes, the community expectations that were just mentioned, economics and markets, the kinds of drivers in our system that are also very dynamic and will continue to be and potentially continue to be more so. So how can we support more diverse ways of generating the knowledge that we need to be able to develop and cope with that change? Supporting Indigenous-led research, rethinking infrastructure and technology from a human and an ecological perspective. How can data, Indigenous and non-Indigenous science, technology and infrastructure help those next generations be more flexible and better able to adapt or anticipate those increasingly dynamic changes? So there's some themes that I just wanted to put into the mix in response to all of the excellent points that have been made so far. I'm now going to pass back. We're going to go in the same order that we had the panelists speak in before, just for one key point that you would like to comment on or reflect on or challenge that you've heard from one of the other speakers before we move to questions from the floor. So we start back with Michelle. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorrae. Your points about connection and thinking forward to future generations really resonate with me. And I'd like to pick up on something you said, Kate, about is Australia ready to have some of those tough conversations about what we need to change? And I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but I always come back to the Darling and the Murray-Darling and the way that we handle water, and we treat water as a commodity. We really do. That's what happens when you turn it into a market, and it just comes down to who's got the most money. And should we really be growing things for profit when this is the outcome? Because this is going to keep happening if that's what we're going to do. And at what point does a river stop being a river and it just becomes an irrigation channel? Because that's also how it operates at the moment, that there's water locked up in weir pools and off-river storages, and there's no actual water coming down the river and letting the river be a river. And you talked about the Barker Darling drying up in your lifetime. And there's good scientific evidence stretching back thousands of years that indicate that the Darling hardly ever used to run dry in the past. So this is definitely climate change, but it's also the amount of water that we're taking out of the river. And in Aboriginal culture, we think of river as the mother and a spirit, and it's sacred. And that's not just because we're cute and we believe in mythology, but it's also just really practical. Like, if the river's in good condition, it's going to look after us. And that's the best way to move forward with climate adaptation, is to start from a good, healthy starting point. And I just wanted to put out a challenge to all of you as you move through your work and in your life, and really think about what are our objectives moving forward as a community. And when you're in conversations about water management, who is at the table with you? Who's missing from the table with you? Are Aboriginal people there? Are Aboriginal women there? Because often they're missing as well. So just keep in mind that everybody needs to be at the table in making these decisions that are going to have long-lasting impacts on our communities into the future.
Thanks, Michelle. Cynthia.
Thank you. Tough to choose a single point. So many good points that came up from everyone. I think what I'll pick up on is this whole idea around collaboration, because I've spent 20 plus years leading transdisciplinary collaborations all around the world and on all sorts of different topics. And the last few years, I spent a whole lot of time trying to work out what is it that holds us back in those projects, because I could never tell ahead of time which of those projects, and I've led, I don't know, about 100, which I could never tell ahead of time which ones were going to go woohoo and which ones were just going to tick the box and that'll be it, kind of thing. So I spent some time trying to work out what is it, and it turns out it's us, and it's about how we are as people. It's about, so we all talk a lot about collaboration, but it's actually about how we show up and how we've gone through our adult development processes in order to be able to show up in ways where we can really say diversity is a gift. So we know a lot. If you look across adult development and philosophy and psychology and learning and systems and all these other disciplines that I did to try and come up with a model for this, it's about two things. One, our relationship to truth. Are we able to let go of the stuff that we hold really dear in order to be able to make space for another person's truth? Are we able to let the context determine what actually matters most in a particular situation? And when we're doing stuff, so that's one dimension, is about our relationship to truth. The second dimension is about how far back we're able to get when we're thinking about our role in what's in front of us. Are we here kind of doing stuff? Are we able to think about what it was that we were, how we might do that better next time? Or are we able to step way back and notice that something about the way that we showed up held up the process or made things sore? So how we show up matters enormously in whether our collaborations and whether our governance processes can actually deliver on their promise. And it's possible for us to build these capacities. And I reckon that's what we need to be focusing on. And that's why I keep throwing this love word about the place. Even though my background is science and engineering, I think it matters, because I think how we are with ourselves actually determines how we're able to be with others.
Yeah, so many good points. I think mine, and something that I probably, when I started my water advocacy journey, we didn't really speak much about, but it started to come out in, I think, the last 12 months or so, even more so, is this idea of quality of water, not just quantity. Because I think within the basin plan, we spoke so much about quantities of water getting here. And I reckon the first time when I really saw this was actually talking about cultural flows and like the request that a sufficient quality and quantity of water is flowing down our rivers. And I think that's really important, because we've seen it a number of times where a little bit of water flows through, and Uncle Badger Bates calls it shut up water, because it's a little bit of water and it's not good. You can't use it for anything. It doesn't help your community. It's yucky water. And we've really seen it after the recent floods in Menindee. So my partner, where I live some of the time now too, he's just above Menindee, and he's grown up on that river. And he said that he's never seen the quality of water turn so quickly after a flood event. And you look at the quality of that water right now, like, I am a water rat. I will swim in absolutely everything, and I will not touch that water because it is green and stagnant and horrific. And it is not meant to be that way so quickly after a flood. And like, that's from, everyone's knowledge knows that. So I think really looking at that quality of water that we've got flowing down our rivers is really important moving forward, and a discussion that needs to be had a lot more.
Thank you. Paul.
Thanks, Lorrae. A couple of points, if I may. So just to follow up on the question of water quality, Section 9.07 of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan sets out very specific objectives in terms of raw water quality for treatment for human consumption. And yes, there is some evaluation on blackwater events and on salinity, but there are specific objectives there in relation to the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines that seem to have disappeared. And there seems to have been a decision made by basin states that we are not going to try and meet these objectives and we're not going to monitor them. And I stand to be, I'm very happy to be corrected, but I haven't seen anything in terms of the MDBA's evaluation plans, evaluations that actually pick up on this objective in the basin plan. And that's really, really important. Again, pointy head of economists maybe, but you can't manage what you don't measure. And just to follow up on Michelle's comments about what the objectives are and what it is that we're actually trying to achieve in terms of water management, I think it's really, really important in the discussion around the economics of water buybacks, right? Purchasing water on the market from willing sellers. So we will see more and more now in the political discussion about how there will be economic impacts and some values put on those economic impacts. Now, Professor Sarah Wheeler at the University of Adelaide was commissioned by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority to do a really important piece of work, which is available on the website as an input to the Basin Outlook. And what it does partly is does a literature review of all of the different research and evidence and consulting reports which have been commissioned to look at this specific question. And touching on Matt's comment before with regards to misinformation and the quality of information, what they do is they go through the different reports and assess how it was that particular results that particular groups might be advocating for, and how they arrived at those very, very high estimates of the economic costs. So I think I would recommend that everybody have a look at that, because I think it's going to be very important in terms of the political discussion that we have more assessment and evaluation of the information which is out in the public discourse. And that's partly a role for government. It's partly a role for, I think, the academy as well, to be part of that process, and Academy of Social Sciences and whatnot. But to make sure that there is some peer review, if you like, or evaluation of the information which has been put out. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Matt.
Hard to pick one, and I'm actually going to avoid talking about information and data, even though I'm very passionate about it, except to say that please talk to me about water quality data, because I think it's time that we did a bit more in that space, and I think that we can. So the point I'm actually going to pick up on is not something that I have an answer to or even a vision on. It's actually something I'm really struggling with, and I'd love to talk to people about it. And it's this issue of relationships and collaboration, but particularly as it relates to the way that agencies, government agencies, probably even universities, I suspect, any organisations engage with communities. And I'm really struggling with it at the moment, because I see a lot of stuff that comes from a good place and is not producing good outcomes. So I don't really know how to describe it, but I'll put an example. So at the moment, if you deliver a project or a policy proposal in any government in Australia, and I suspect it's the same in other institutions, it's, have you engaged with First Nations people? As a result, I know a few Indigenous elders, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, who have a constant queue of people kicking down their door to consult with them on their ideas. So in my program alone, in the Bureau of Meteorology, I have 4 projects that require me to consult with Indigenous people. You magnify that across the agency, across the whole of the Australian government, across all state governments, across all local governments, across all universities. And we're just demanding time with people to talk about our ideas. And it all comes from a place of good intention, but we need to really think about engaging with people in a different way. And I don't know the answer. But I did have a pretty positive experience recently, which made me think about things differently. So we've been doing a bit of work looking at First Nations water information, and we're doing a pilot in the Gwydir catchment in northern New South Wales. And for two reasons, we're doing the Gwydir one. We're well supported by Phil Duncan, who's going to be here today, who's a Gomeroi man. And it's also where I'm from. So, you know, we quite like working together on our own country. And he said, come up for 2 days. We'll bring on, you know, we'll have a chat with some elders. Don't have an agenda. Don't bring any points. So we sat there for 2 days and we rolled out a giant map. A couple of people on this panel have seen my obsession with maps, but it's a 2.5 by 5 meter map, and we just sat on it and we chatted for 2 days. And at the end of that 2 days, the elder said, we trust you now. We know you're not here to sort of spin us. Come back, meet with us again, and we'll talk more. Don't send other people. Don't send other people from your agency. We want to see you. And that to me makes me question everything about the way that all institutions, but particularly governments, engage with people, which is sort of a bit of a ticker box exercise to a project. And it's about delivering on the project. So I know I want to do it differently, but I don't know how. So that's my sort of request, is talk to me about it.
Thank you. Matt.
Thanks. I'll just be fairly quick. One thing that I've certainly been grappling with, and Kate touched on this a little bit with saying water is a resource, is not a commodity, is the way that we do think about water as a commodity, and how this then manifests itself is it doesn't always seem to fit with it. It causes difficulties in decision making when we think of it as a commodity. So water is one of those things you can certainly value, but if you don't have water, instantly it becomes priceless and you can't value it. It becomes forget about any value. It's absolutely priceless. So there's that. Now we're not often in that situation, but it's one of those things that's not like most other things that we value in that sort of way. It can move from being a very cheap, very readable resource to an extremely life-threatening resource or lack of resource. So, and that comes in other areas in terms of what we're talking about, water quality, in terms of how we're now thinking about other values and other values attached to that water, and how do we value that. We've seen that in things like the Murray-Darling Basin, where we have heavily commodified that water that's in there. That when we start catching up and realising that our First Nations people don't have anywhere near as much of that water as they should, or and have no access, then we get ourselves involved in financial discussions and budget discussions, because it's going to require umpteen number of millions and billions to effectively take that water and transfer its use. Now that could be good decision making in terms of supporting decision making, but it is problematic there where already a system has been established, and then we have to come on, then almost a bit late to the party, people realise that there's a misallocation that's gone on here. So I think that commodification is something that it's there, it is valuable, but it's causing quite a few difficulties, I think, for decision making, is how you do that. And I mentioned the thing about it might be cheaper to trucking bottled water, but is it the right thing to do? So that's again where it's not quite. There's obviously other values and expectations coming in that don't lend themselves easily to that commodification of water. And I think water is very unique in that nature, which we do struggle with.
Thanks everyone for all of those comments. We're also struggling with time, as we only have around 10 minutes now for some questions from the audience. I'm happy to start if there are any questions in the room, and we also can have questions online. I'll just take the one just right here. Thank you. Please introduce yourself briefly. Try and keep your questions brief. If we keep both the questions and the responses as brief as possible, we'll get through a few more. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Hall, CEO and Managing Director of the Malone Institute. We work with rural and Indigenous communities across the country, restoring the function of their landscapes with a special focus on water. Just listening to the conversation today, we know how to do this work. Communities and Indigenous communities are keen to do this work. We know how to scale this work. We have a prioritised map for catchment rehydration across New South Wales. We know the regulatory reform that is required, but gaining traction with government agencies is incredibly challenging. And part of that is, I think, that we are a new model for collaboration and action and getting work done in the water space. So I'm just interested to hear, in terms of water security for the future, how the panel thinks that landscape function and rebuilding that in partnership with communities can have a place.
Thanks. I might throw to Matt Dadswell for a comment on that, as the part of it was around government, and then perhaps any brief comments from anyone.
A couple of things to touch on there. I think the benefit of catchment scale and planning and so forth. So I think that's something that again, governments tend to go in cycles on these sorts of things around the basis and benefits of doing catchment and planning at a catchment level and so forth, that can tailor to the particular features of a catchment. I think the other thing is, it's often government is looked to as the driver on things, but ultimately government reacts to community and expectations and so forth, in generally speaking. So it's sort of about that, building that community interest and expectation that ultimately tends to drive government, and particularly if you want long-term drive rather than sort of more electoral cycle type drive.
Quick comment from Kate. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think I can just, oh yeah, thank you. I think like rehydrating landscapes is going to be really important moving forward, but I do think it comes back to also that transparency element of where is the water and where is it going in terms of what that looks like. And I think at the moment there's so much distrust within the basin with people up and downstream and whatnot, that I actually think there's a lot more work to be done in exactly that, of like where the water is, what type of quality it is, and what it's being used for. I think that has a big role to play before we get to that point as well, like moving forward.
Thank you. Do we have a question online?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So we have a question from Jason Mingo for Paul on transparency and evidence base. What are your thoughts on how to drive customer literacy to understand this data? Is this up to water regulators to make data more customer friendly in how it's presented, or should there be greater responsibility on the customer to self-inform on the data that can be made available?
Thanks very much. That's a really, really great question, Jason. I guess one of the major challenges, particularly for smaller service providers, is that it's expensive to do that customer engagement and to do that reporting. So I would suggest, having spent a lot of time going through all the different reporting, Power and Water Corporation, the Northern Territory, in terms of their reports and in terms of reporting the data, is extraordinary, right, in terms of the level of transparency and what is provided. Now, that's not going to be possible for a smaller local council in New South Wales or in Queensland. So I think there's probably a role there for governments, and particularly in this case, state governments, to be looking less at capital infrastructure subsidies, but actually providing subsidies around operations to enable these smaller council service providers to be able to provide that sorts of information, and to be able to have a conversation about, okay, this is what it means if we have exceedance associated with this particular characteristic of water, and have that type of conversation going on, because it's going to cost a lot of money. You know, a lot of these service providers might only have 3, 4, 5 permanent staff. So I think there's definitely a role for government to be helping service providers to be able to really engage with customers and improve that literacy. Thank you.
Matt Coulton, briefly.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think we are on the cusp of a bit of a new generation in water data. And one of the reasons water information has been quite inaccessible in the past is we haven't had a lot of great observation or timely observation. The gaps have been filled with models, and models are great, but they're all wrong, and some are useful. And some of that stuff that we stood up in sort of 2007 to fill the gaps, we now have near daily satellite observations, down to very fine resolution that describe what's happening in the landscape, where we used to use models. We have telemetry, we have cloud-based computing. A lot of the sort of confusion that has been built around depending on models I hope will go away when we replace it with more observations that people can access directly.
Thank you. We are very close to time. I'll take one more question from the floor.
Peter Crabb, I'm associated with Penner School here. 30 years ago to the day, ABC Four Corners program was titled Running the River. I had the privilege of being part of that. All of the points that were made on that program are still valid to this day. The introduction that Andrew Olley provided, he could say today, go and listen to it. Running the River, broadcast on the 18th of October, 30 years ago. We haven't learned from the past. Tolbert, I take your point of looking to the future, we have to. But if we don't learn from the past, we go on making the same mistakes. And that has been my experience of having an involvement with Barry since the mid-1960s. It grieves me to think that we're still talking about the same issues. When are we going to learn?
I'm going to throw that one to Cynthia.
I wasn't expecting that, but thank you, Lorrae. Peter, thank you. And I'm sure that for people who've been working in the water space for a long time, you know, there's many who would share your frustrations. To respond to your question and to respond to what I'm hearing here as well, and Carolyn, to respond to your question too about the challenges of engaging with bureaucracy, there is another way, and Wales, the country of Wales, has shown us how to do that. We could choose as a country to undertake a massive engagement campaign, and this is what Wales did. Wales used to be a coal country, right? Their economy was going down the gurgler. They did this massive engagement program across the whole country to come up with 7 principles about the Wales we want. Google it. They are so good. But not only did they come up with the principles, what they also did was enshrine them in legislation. And enshrining them in legislation means that every government agency at every level needs to justify its actions against those principles. What that does is to massively shift where money flows in government. The very first Future Generations Commissioner on the planet, there's actually a few now because a few other countries are heading this way and the UN's heading this way too. What she tells the most brilliant stories about stopping motorways, for example, about actually getting investment in the things that we know matter because government agencies have to head in the directions of these principles. And I mean, you can guess what they are, right? It's just that we're not enabled, our government agencies are not enabled to do what matters. But we could do a process like that. And water, because it's so central and because it's exactly as you said, Matt, we call it an A to Z issue for a reason, right? When there's a drought, it's an A issue. But the rest of the time, water is central. Water could drive the need for this kind of a conversation in Australia. I'll leave it there. I might be a little bit passionate about that idea.
The concept of learning from history, Peter, I take your point that 30 years is an insignificant amount of time, but I'm going to throw to Michelle because 65,000 years is also a time frame where we can think about learning from history and from bodies of knowledge. So Michelle, for the final comments, thank you.
Thanks, Lorrae. Definitely. And I hear the same kind of sentiments from the elders all the time. Like, you've already come and consulted with us. You've already got a report that says exactly the same question that you're asking, but you haven't bothered to go and read it. And it's always the same answer. And I think, like you suggested, Cynthia, you just have to encourage people to care. Like, unless people care, it's going to come back to the existing legislation, and the only way we can change the existing legislation is by changing the political will. So that has to become more important than, you know, sitting on our heels and just maintaining the status quo as we have been for the last however many decades. And then I think that bottom-up approach that you mentioned in rehydrating the landscapes and rehabilitating from a country perspective, like a patchwork of all these different places. And that's the only way to do rehabilitation, because from what I've heard from all the research is you can't just take one approach and blanket, pop it out everywhere else, because it won't work. You need local knowledge to make it work, and you need the community to be invested to take care of it, to make it work. So it has to have that grassroots level care for country that to rebuild the health of the landscape.
Thank you. All right, so unfortunately that does bring us to time and to a close. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to all of the questions that were in the room, and I'm sure there were plenty more online. So regardless, I hope that you've all been able to take away something extraordinary from this panel, and I certainly have. I'd like to quickly express some thanks to DQ for their support and in running this panel today and organising it, to Jenny, to Carly, to Erin, to Emma from the IWF ANU team as well. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen, so my thanks to all of you. And of course, huge thanks to all of the panelists for sharing their views in ways that, have been really, I think, candid and open and really genuine conversation. And I appreciate it is an important topic in so many ways. It is an emotional topic. It is something that we all connect with and all feel on many, many levels. So I really appreciate the honesty and the genuine way in which everybody's engaged with this today. Please join me in thanking all of the panel speakers. And with that, we will close. Thank you, everybody.